sick.
Are they?
I had
Because they don't be wearing a mask.
Yeah. It was,
Yeah.
it's like
I'm
what?
telling y'all, even if you just don't want a cold, the mask is a good idea. So, I take it off when I'm 6 feet back from you, but I put it back on. So we're going to start with our grounding, and then we're going to hop into a few things. Let's start with our land, labor, and life acknowledgement. I think you read the first, didn't you read before?
Yeah.
You read, Ayana. Jill, did you read? Okay. So why don't we have you start with the first slide? And remember, everybody, if you could put your, close your computers just for this part. And if you can, put both feet on the ground, hands in your lap, palms up. And you want to sit as erectly as possible. Have we talked about like meditation? This is not a meditation. It's like a mini meditation, but it's a grounding. We call it a grounding. Have we talked about why we do this? We talked about why we do the land, labor, and life acknowledgement, but what the breaths are about.
No.
Okay. So I believe in meditation. I know the power of meditation, and this is not even really debatable. Like every medical professional will tell you that your health will be much better if you meditate. I will say that includes your mental health will be much better if you meditate. But it's been proven that even in terms of things like your blood sugar, your blood pressure, those kinds of things come into sync better when you meditate. So I think of it as, this is not a full meditation, these are just breaths, but breath is at the center of meditation. I think of it as when you get up in the morning, what do you do before you leave the house? Not everything, don't tell me everything. But you take a shower, right? Hopefully. Why do you take a shower?
Be clean.
To clean your body, right? Because stuff gets on you throughout the day, right? And you want to clean your body. You want to clean all of that muck off of you. Well, spiritually, stuff gets on you too, right? When you felt it, when you walk into spaces, this feels subdued. It doesn't feel negative, but it feels subdued. But sometimes you've walked into spaces and you can feel like negative energy, even violent energy. You want to wash that off of you. And meditation is like, I call it like a shower for your soul. But it's also like a raincoat, right? So all day people are throwing stuff. And maybe they don't even mean to hit you, but they just got their stuff and they're throwing it, right? When you've meditated, you'll find that it doesn't stick as much as if you haven't meditated. So these breaths are about just taking some time back, remembering that, you know, we are, I believe we're spiritual beings, that there's a necessity in a world, especially for Black folks, that doesn't care about you. It's important that we care for ourselves and each other. And we recognize our own humanity and our own divinity in doing so. That's what these breaths are about. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay. So with that, the reason that we sit erectly, if you can, is to be able to get as much breath into your body as possible. So this is how we sit, and we begin by just taking a deep breath in. And let it fill up your chest, but also, more importantly, your belly. And release. Jill, can you read the first slide?
This land that we inhabit is physically situated in the original ancestral homelands of the Tonga, Quiche, Chumash, and Gabrielino people. We pay respect to the Tonga, Quiche, Chumash, and Gabrielino, and all indigenous people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout their historical diaspora.
And take another deep breath in. And breathe out. Messiah, can you read that one?
pay homage to those who were stolen from Africa, placed in bondage, falsely named as chattel, and forced into labor, who were called slaves but never submitted as such, who have always been fully human with an unbroken connection to the divine and to each other. We honor our African ancestors for the still uphold labor which built what is now the Americas.
Take another deep breath in. And breathe out. Myron, can you read the last one?
To both our indigenous and African forebears, we commit to the continued struggle for liberation and reparation for it is only through freedom and justice that we truly give honor. Ashe.
Ashe. All right, so we needed that because we're going to start with something that you're going to need a raincoat for. Over the weekend, is that not going? Do I have to completely? Okay. Maybe the creator said that's too much. Let's try this. No, it's still up there. That's so weird. There. Okay, I did. Close PowerPoint all the way. So some of you may have seen this video, and some of you may not have. But we closed out class with a call to action on Thursday. Anybody remember what the call to action was? What was the call to action?
Sign the petition.
Sign the petition for
Brittany.
Brittany Martin. Who got other people to sign the petition? Omar, how many did you get?
Probably like 15.
Oh, good job. How about you, Ayana?
One.
One. Okay, so we're going to keep the contest going, okay? So for today, let's all clap it up for Omar. Good job, Omar. This is your gift today. Okay, it's one of the best books you'll ever read. Asada by Asada Shakur. So keep going. Try to beat Omar with 15. We'll see what you do next Tuesday. We'll measure it again, okay? So I'll have something else for y'all on next Tuesday.
Okay.
But we want to keep that going. What we didn't talk about, because we were running out of time on last Thursday's class, we didn't talk about the targeting of black women. And oftentimes when we think about police violence or state violence, we do uplift black men. And black men are the primary targets of the state for physical violence. They're the primary targets of the state for physical violence. When you talk about assassinations, it's very difficult when you think of women who've been assassinated. There's very few women who've been assassinated. There's women, though, like Marielle Franco that we have to uplift, right? We have to remember that it does happen, it just doesn't happen as often. When we think about lynchings, right, traditional lynchings, there are women who were lynched, right? But most of the folks who were lynched were black men. Most of the organizers were black women. Anti-lynching, what they called themselves crusaders, were black women, but most of the victims of lynching were black men. And so that's what we're used to thinking of when we think about the Black Lives Matter era. We think about people like who? George Floyd. Who else do we think of? Trayvon Martin. Who else do we think of? Eric Garner, Ezell Ford, Dejan Kazee. I'm giving you names in Los Angeles. You were invited to a court date for Ryan Twyman, right? We think of all these men, and we also have to remember that women are also killed by the state. So one of the women that we've been organizing for the most fully in Los Angeles is Waukesha Wilson, who was killed inside LA Metro Detention Center, right? We can think of Megan Hockaday, who was killed inside her own home after a domestic dispute by police. We can think about Riddell Jones, who was in the midst of a mental health challenge, who was killed right behind the Crenshaw Baldwin Hills Mall. And so we have to remember that black women are also despised and targeted by the state. Targeted through police violence, and also targeted by a system of prisons that comes from where? So if police descend from slave catching, have we talked about that yet? That this is not debatable, right? Guadalupe, are you the only criminal justice major? We had a few others, didn't we? Ayana, okay. So if you study any book that looks at the history of policing, there's no debate among criminal justice scholars. We know that American policing comes from a system of slave catching. Is this new information to you all, or did you know that already? You knew that already, right? So this isn't, I say everything is a matter of perspective. This is not perspective. This is factual. This is not my interpretation. There's a through line between slave catching and the creation of American policing. You can even see it in the way that the badges looked, right? And so we need to understand that. We also need to understand, just as policing descends from slave catching, you all know what we mean. I don't want to assume you know what I'm talking about when I say slave catching. You know what slave patrols were? Myron, you know what slave patrols were? No. Okay. Messiah, you know what slave patrols were? Ayana, do you know what slave patrols were? Okay. Right. That was perfect. And I caught that. Enslaved people, good practice. One of the greatest crimes that enslaved people could be considered as committing was running away from their slave owner, right? And so what they would do is there was a group of usually poor white folks that were deputized and made slave patrols. They were sometimes called paddy rollers, right? And they would go and search for escaped enslaved people. Okay, so they would ride on horseback most of the time and search. They were like bounty hunters, would return enslaved people to their so-called owners. Well, those people actually became contemporary police. That system evolved into contemporary policing. Okay, does that make sense to y'all? We also need to know that most enslaved people, or many enslaved people, worked where? Where was our labor force? Where were our ancestors' labor force out of us? Blessing, do you know? What were those places called?
Where the slaves were?
Huh?
Where the
Mhm.
in Ghana?
In Ghana, well, a lot of us were stolen from Ghana, right? A lot of us were stolen from Ghana, but when we got to the United States,
Was
we did.
Virginia? Was it Virginia?
In the field.
We arrived in Virginia,
Right.
right? Was the first place where enslaved people arrived. My ancestors actually arrived into Texas, Sabine Pass, Texas was the port we came in. But where were we worked? Somebody said in the fields. In the fields, those fields were often called plantations, right? Plantations. So plantations actually became our contemporary prisons, right? In fact, there's many many prisons that are on the same land. So there's a famous prison in Mississippi called Parchment. I might have mentioned it. Did I? I don't remember if I did or not. But you can actually see the what are they called? The wardens on horseback in the field, where imprisoned folks are still working the fields and overseen by wardens on horsebacks, right? We can think about, what's the one in Louisiana doing? With a, you know what I'm talking about.
I can't think the name of it.
Yeah, there's one in Louisiana. I don't know why my brain isn't working well. It starts with an A. Angola prison in Louisiana, which is on the land of plantation land, right? So I'm saying all that to say that when we think about police as descending from who?
Slave patrol.
Slave patrol, slave catchers, and prisons descending from what?
Plantation.
Plantations, that the targeting of black bodies by both police and prisons is intentional and by design. We're not reading his book in this class, but there's a brilliant scholar named Manning Marable who wrote a book called, my favorite book of his, is called How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. And it's a U.S. take on another book by a brilliant scholar named Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So in Marable's book, he talks about how these systems of oppression are deliberately and intentionally designed to produce the outcomes that they do. Deliberately and intentionally designed to produce the outcomes that they do. It's not accidental that black women are the fastest growing group of imprisoned folks. It's not accidental that black children are charged with what they call willful disobedience in schools, right? It's not accidental that black people are on the bottom of virtually every single social, political, and economic measure. Those systems, the economic systems, the political systems, even the social systems, are created to produce the outcomes that they do. We were walking up, when Billion and I were walking up to campus, we were talking about a young black father and how he's been targeted by the state for bringing his child to public meetings, and they've even threatened DCFS action on him. I, as a mother, when I used to bring, when my children were little, I still do it, but they're not little anymore. When I used to bring them to protests and actions, multiple times I was threatened that they were going to call, police would threaten me with calling DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, threatening to put my children in foster care. That's the reason that black people are the plurality of the foster care system, because we're actually targeted, right? If you look at the data, black people don't abuse their children more than other people. It's that we're targeted by systems. Does that make sense to you all? Okay. So I'm lifting that up because I do want to talk about black women in particular. We're, again, looking at a contemporary political prisoner. What is a political prisoner?
It's a prisoner who's in prison for their political ideology.
Political idea, yes.
Like their beliefs, right?
Yeah, their beliefs and political ideologies. So they're not being held for the alleged crime that they committed. It's their political beliefs, political work, political ideology. And so when we think about that, when we think about who's in prison and why, we often think of political prisoners that are men, right? So we talked about Baba Mutulu Shakur. Everybody, if you're a praying person, please pray for Seku Odinga, who was one of the members of the Black Liberation Army that actually helped to free Assata. The book that you have, Omar, is written by a woman named Assata Shakur, who was freed from prison in 72, 71? 72. And Baba Seku Odinga is one of the people who did that. He did 30-something years in prison for his role in her release, and he's now having some health issues, so we want to make sure we pray for him, if you're a praying person. So when we think about political prisoners, we tend to focus on men like George Jackson, and they are the plurality of those. The majority of Black people who are in prison are men, right? But there are some contemporary political prisoners like Brittany Martin who are in prison. And so we got to free Brittany Martin. Also, one of the things that we know is when Black women go to prison, and it affects more directly not just them, but who? Their children. So Brittany Martin is a mother of 6 kids, right? What does it mean that she's in prison? What does it mean that her daughter, she was pregnant when she was arrested? What does it mean that her daughter, whose name is Blessing, was born inside the prison, right? And that Brittany didn't get to nurse her or mother her, right? So we need to think about those things, and we need to take action. We also need to think about how Black women are despised and condemned by the system of policing. And so over the weekend, body camera footage came out. There was a young Black mother named Takiya Young. And I'm gonna show you some video. If it's too much for you, you're welcome to walk out. But I believe we shouldn't look away. No matter how hard it is, we shouldn't look away. Can y'all hear? The audio doesn't matter really, but I don't know why it's not coming on. She said, "What are you gonna shoot me?" Everybody take a breath. to all know her name. She was a 21-year-old mother of 2 young boys. She was 7 months pregnant with her 3rd child, which was a girl. Neither she nor the baby survived. She was accused of shoplifting from a Kroger. So I want us to understand that because the work that we do is important. It has impact on real lives, Had you all heard of the murder of Takiya Young before this? No. Okay. So this happened right outside of Columbus, Ohio. But I want you to also think about not just the actions of the police. How did you interpret those actions?
Unlawful.
Unlawful. Unlawful. What else?
Escalated way too quickly. Unnecessarily as well.
Why do you say unnecessarily?
Well, you could see the Kroger shop was right there. She parked right outside of it. I feel like some sort of conversation should have happened where she could have explained what happened, or if that wasn't her who did it or whatever. They asked her with the windows closed when she was still in the car, and then he started to shoot us up. Whatever.
So I posted this on my Instagram, and I was appalled that about probably 10% of the comments were people saying, well, she deserved it because she didn't comply. What do you all think about that?
Why is violence the first thing that comes to it? Like, why would violence be the first thing? I don't know, especially if she wouldn't do it, of course, you'd be defensive. And you're outnumbered, and these people have weapons. You're scared.
Jill?
I mean, first of all, she's accused of stealing from a grocery store, which, like, is an inherent problem. Like, you're hungry, so, like, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But, like, there's no instance to me where food, property, the most expensive thing in a Kroger is worth more than someone's life. And so I definitely agree with all the adjectives used, but also just, like, psychotic and hateful. Like, I mean, it's just not even, they're just not comparable, like, in any sort of way.
Right. Anybody else have any thoughts? No? Yeah, I am.
So I mean, if you think about like policing and stuff like that, they're always supposed to use deadly force when somebody proposes himself as an enemy. That woman didn't propose herself as a threat. She didn't try to flee or resist. So I mean, there was no reason to use deadly force like that. So I mean, just another way to just cheat the system, I guess.
I also think like, and well, unless anybody else want to chime in, go ahead, Leslie.
I listen to everybody what they said, but not to be negative or anything, but I felt like she also trying to like fight back with the police a little bit. I understand that the police doesn't have guns and stuff, but if you were like that innocent, I wouldn't say that innocent, but like if you know in your heart that you didn't steal anything, you should have just, like they say, get out. The first time you should have just probably just like got out the car instead of trying to still drive by and drive by.
That she should have just gotten out the car. Maybe you're right. Maybe. And she didn't. So, did that excuse them killing her?
No, not killing her, but
I mean, I hear what you're saying, right? That's what we hear often is, well, if they just complied, they'd still be alive, is what we hear. There are many, many instances of people who just complied and still wind up dead, right?
like George Floyd.
Like George Floyd, like Christopher DeAndre Mitchell, like Ryan Twyman, right? You don't know. I don't give my children instructions to just comply because maybe you're safer if you run, right? Maybe if you run in a zigzag, they can't shoot that straight. Maybe, because we don't know, right? We don't know if she just complied. Would they have beaten her, or would they have imprisoned her? Or, I mean, I think about this, that nothing, I think Jill said it, nothing in that Kroger is worth her life. Nothing. And I think we have to get to a point as a society where we say, I don't give a damn what they did or what you say they did. You don't get to kill them, right? And I think we have to be very clear about not repeating the talking points that have always been used to steal Black life. Does that make sense to you? Can you imagine a world where a young white woman were gunned down for shoplifting from a grocery store? Who do they paint as the criminals? And y'all, criminal justice folks, rescue me if I'm wrong, okay? Who do they say are the shoplifters or the thieves of our society? Black men. Who else? Black people in general. Have y'all been watching on a loop these smash and grabs and been told crime is out of control and this is why we have to spend more money on policing? Have you been told that? You've been watching that? Did you know that according to LAPD's own weekly statistics, crime is down by about 7%? So they're showing you this on Friday before I had to go out of town, but on Friday I just happened to watch the local news, and LAPD was showing off this huge bust of a crime ring, of a, we caught these smash and grabbers, and they had these tables full of the merchandise that they had stolen. You can look back on it, right? Look back at this coverage. What was on the tables, which was stolen from CVS and Ross, was underwear, bras, socks, and deodorant. One, I bet you they didn't smash and grab that stuff. Two, does that sound like people engaging in just lawlessness? Why would you steal underwear? Yeah, ain't nobody getting rich off a CVS brand underwear, right? And then they found that the people were then selling it to small shops in the alley, in Santee Alley. And the LAPD said, if you go to buy something and the price is too good to be true, it probably is, and you're a criminal too. Look, if I need deodorant so bad that I gotta go to the alley and pay $1 or $2 instead of the $5, $6 it costs at CVS, then I needed the deodorant. I'm not a criminal. I just can't afford the cost of living here. So this is kind of what they portray, that these are big rings that you all, and my mother told me not to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, that you all as the public are told are threats to your life. You're told when they come into Nordstrom or Louis Vuitton or Gucci, it threatens your safety somehow. Have you all seen people getting hurt in the smash and grabs? No, right? They smash, they grab, and they run, right? Or my mom was like, but I was in a store. I hope my mom's not watching. I was in a store, I think she was in TJ Maxx, and she saw somebody come in, her and my baba saw somebody come in and steal a whole rack of clothes. And I asked her, I was like, well, were you hurt in that theft? And she said, no. I said, what did you do? She said, I just stepped back. Exactly, right? I'm lifting that to say that you are shaken into fear. You're told to be fearful about people who aren't even stealing from you. They're stealing from corporations like a Kroger. And that same line of thinking where they go, oh, it's smash and grabs, you need more police, is the same line of thinking that says, well, she was in the Kroger and she stole things, and so, she's a thief, and what happens, happens, right? or she stole things and the police gave her an order, and maybe she did or maybe she didn't steal things, but she didn't follow the police instructions, and so they get to steal her life. Remember that those are assignments that are only given to black people. There would never be a day where a young white mother would be said, where it would be said that she deserved to die because she stole something. Does that make sense to y'all? So I'm lifting that because I want us to jump into, I know we didn't quite get to our Black Power conversation on Thursday. But when we talk about how people rise up against the state, it always begins with emotion. So I think there's a concerted effort for us to buy into their narrative, because if we see what's really happening to our people, to young black mothers, it has to push you into both sorrow and then rage. Sorrow and then rage. So when I watched the body cam footage, because this happened, Takiya's life was stolen on August 25th. But the body cam footage just came out over the weekend. And we're also, remember, everything is by design. I believe they released the body cam. I know they released the body cam over the weekend. Why?
Long weekend?
Long weekend. Media won't pick up on it, right? If you want things to not gain traction, you do it what? You do it on a Friday or over the weekend, because fewer people are on social media, fewer people are watching the news. It doesn't really, right, and it doesn't spark outrage. And so they did it then in order to minimize. Y'all said nobody in this class heard about it, right? And so we have to remember that we can't let go of our emotions. Our emotions are what make us human beings, right? Oh, I forgot about the Zoom.
I was like,
I was
oh, she
thinking about
just
that,
texted me
honestly.
saying, do you know if we're not doing Zoom today, baby? And I
forgot.
said, I
Tell
will wait
them-
for a break in
Tell
lecture.
her I'm sorry, and I'm gonna log on right now, okay? Tell her we just get into the lecture, so we're doing it now. Yep, baby's already on. Baby, I'm sorry, I forgot about you. Sorry about that. Now you're on, okay? You're on mute, but I hope you can hear me. We're just getting to the lecture anyway, and I'll send you the link to what we showed earlier, okay? Why can't I see the? Okay, well, whatever. We'll see it in a minute. So we talked about emotion. Emotion is really what sparks outrage, movement, right? If you don't have emotion, if you don't have rage, you're not going to act. So everyone seems to think that it's just about showing data or appealing to your intellect. If you're just appealing to people's intellect, that's not what gets them to move. You raised George Floyd, blessing. And when you saw that video, what happened? What happened? frustration? Did you cry?
I had, no, I don't know. I know I didn't cry.
You didn't cry, but you felt something.
I felt, yeah, no, definitely, because, you know, that could have been my uncle, a family member, you know,
Right.
somebody close to me, so definitely.
Right, right. I felt us need to take a breath after we watched this video with Takiya Young. Yeah. How did you all feel watching it? Now, what did you think? How did you feel? Go ahead, sir.
It's just like so disappointing to see. It's very emotional. When I think too much about it, I start getting really calm. Now I feel like I restrain myself sometimes. I was very, very invested. I was very, very vocal about standing up for us and all of that for a very long time, especially during COVID. Put a lot of time, put a lot of effort to really speak up for what's right. And watching videos, like it got to a point where I just couldn't do it anymore, so I stopped. I never watched a video again. Couldn't do it just because it actually messed me up mentally. So seeing that was like
Triggering?
yeah, a little bit.
I'm sorry for triggering you.
No, it's okay.
And I feel like we got to, because what's happened from 2020 to 2023 is people being lulled back to sleep and seeking a comfortable place in oppression. We know intellectually the system is oppressive, but we seek to just make ourselves safe, right? If I can just find my own little space of safety, then I'll be okay. My thing is that you'll never be okay until we transform this world, right? So I have a 13, 16, and 19-year-old. And everybody knows what the talk is. Yeah. So my mom gave me the talk, and I'm expected to give my children the talk about just comply. If you get pulled over, just yes, officer, no, officer, right?
Right, like show ID, read it.
Right. Keep your hands on the steering wheel, all of that. I can give you a million examples, but the one example I'm going to give you is of a little boy named Andrew Joseph III, who was 14 years old when he was killed as a result of police misconduct in Florida. He was a perfect child. He was not only a perfect child, but the child of a perfect set of parents. Both his parents had graduate degrees. His father was an educator, his mother is a mental health provider, right? They were the perfect family. They lived in the suburbs, sent their kids to private school. They were devout Catholics.
It's about to cut off
What is?
the battery.
They were perfect, and that didn't save Andrew, right? And so we got to remember that the talk that's probably a terrible angle. Felt like she had to shoplift for food, right? That's the first injustice, right? Then we need to go back and create societies of fairness, societies of care. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay. And maybe we still don't know if she even shoplifted. We don't know. She was accused of shoplifting. But if you shoplifted from a grocery store, right, we begin by saying, what kind of society has pregnant women shoplifting for groceries, right? So it's really important that we don't just allow ourselves to be lulled to sleep. We talked about this definition of power. This is where we left off last time. I want to get to that question of emotion. Everybody knows what led to the WhatsApp Rising of 1965. The WhatsApp Rising of 1965. all know about the Watts Uprising
Yep.
of 1965. Myron, you
It
know.
was over Rodney B. Wasn't it?
Rodney King,
Yeah.
that was 1992.
Oh.
But it was a similar situation, right? In 1965, there was a black motorist in Watts named Marquette Fry, who was pulled over by LAPD and was being brutalized. And the neighborhood didn't just allow it to go down like that. They went, and I think his brother was already out. And his brother said, don't think about if you saw your sibling being beaten. His mother was eventually called out of the house. LAPD proceeds to beat his mother and his brother and Marquette and arrest all of them. The neighborhood went up in flames, literally, right? You gotta think about that it was that outrage that created that uprising. If they just said, well, you should have complied. You know, Marquette be acting up. You know, if they had put it on him instead of on the system that was abusing him, there would have been no Watts Uprising. And maybe you all say, well, that might have been a good thing. I'm going to tell you why. So I think there was also bubbling beneath the surface this recognition that simply complying with an unjust system doesn't give black people on the whole freedom, right? So we were coming out of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was being challenged by young folks especially. So if you think about the civil rights movement, who do you think about? Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, kind of, right? Malcolm X is pushing, right? And so this is who you're thinking about. 1965 is also the year that they assassinated Malcolm X. So the more radical elements of the civil rights movement had been targeted by the state, and they killed Malcolm, right? You see young people coming up through an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You should write that down. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I think I didn't put it up here, no. SNCC is what it's called, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And there were people in SNCC, like the author of the next book that we'll be reading, Kwame Ture, who begin to challenge civil rights organizers. What's interesting is we think about them as the young ones and the civil rights organizers as the old ones, but Martin Luther King was only in his 30s. He wasn't old, right? He's just kind of cast as old in comparison, right? But what they begin to push is black power, because what they're questioning is this whole concept of civil rights. Does everybody know what civil rights means? We call it the civil rights movement and take for granted what we're saying when we say we want civil rights, or that our parents, my parents, and your grandparents wanted civil rights. Do you know what civil rights is? What is civil rights? What does it mean when we say there was a civil rights movement? Yeah. Civil rights is about required governmental intervention, right? So you can think about, sometimes people confuse civil liberties and civil rights. I know Jill knows this because she organizes with the National Lawyers Guild. So people talk about civil liberties. Civil liberties are our right to be free from governmental intervention, right? So our right to privacy, right, is a civil liberty. But civil rights is about requiring something of government, right? So our mothers and grandmothers, our fathers and grandfathers, our forebears, when did they get the right to vote? Huh?
I said much later.
Much later, but when were when did they supposedly get the right to vote?
1965 or 1964 or something.
Well, you see that up there. But also, when was emancipation? Mm-hmm. 1863 is Emancipation Proclamation, but the Civil War isn't one till 1865, right? So they passed these amendments called the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, right? Write this down, you should know this. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments are called the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment is supposed to prohibit slavery, right? Except for what? Omar, except for what? Slavery in this country is prohibited except for what?
Prison.
In cases of imprisonment, right? Slavery is actually not prohibited in foreign court except as punishment for a crime, right? 14th Amendment grants citizenship regardless of race, right? 14th Amendment grants citizenship regardless of race. And then there's a passage of the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment says what?
Right to vote.
Right to vote. Right to vote. So with the passage of the 15th Amendment, in theory, black people were supposed to have the right to vote, and actually, under the period of Reconstruction, black people were voting, black men were voting, running for office, holding seats, right? And then they start to get a little power, and white people get nervous, and they kind of roll back those rights. So Reconstruction is actually a period when the rights of black people were protected by the federal government. The period of Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877. Remember, we talked about that also as a period when white folks, when you see a surge of lynchings, right, during that period. But federal government intervenes to protect the rights of people. They have to be pushed into it, but they protect the rights of people. With the withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877, black people start in increasing numbers being killed for attempting to vote, for attempting to gain political power. Okay? So, in fact, black people did not have the right to vote after 1877. They didn't really in 1865. It just started gaining traction right in 1865. So what happens is a struggle for civil rights. The civil rights struggle is about what government must do to protect the rights of individuals against other individuals or local or state governments. Okay? So the civil rights movement, and some people would say that the civil rights movement begins around the 1950s, 1954, when we think about Brown versus Board of Education, right? We can think about what really sparked it emotionally was the murder of Emmett Till in 1955. Everybody knows Emmett Till. Also a 14-year-old boy who's murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman. It looks like that probably didn't even happen, but allegedly, right? Boy from Chicago who goes to visit his family in Money, Mississippi, and winds up dead, right? For a lot of folks, the murder of Emmett Till and his mother's decision, his mother's name is Mamie Till, to have an open casket funeral for her son who was beaten beyond recognition. You couldn't even tell he was a human being if you saw his head. She decided to have an open casket funeral, and they published those photos in black magazines, Jet magazine in particular, and it sparked outrage among the black community. It really was the catalyst, or one of the catalysts, for the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement is committed to getting governmental intervention so that black people could exercise our rights, okay? And it's incorporation, the effort is incorporation into the current system. So we want to be able to sit at everybody's lunch counter, at white-owned lunch counters, right? We want to be able to spend our money. We want to be able to sit on public transportation. We want to be able to go to the same schools that white people go to. That's the emphasis of the civil rights movement. And you see a push for federal government to intervene. What you see as victories of the civil rights movement is by 1964, you had the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Write that one down. Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bars segregation, especially in public facilities, right? Bars segregation, Civil Rights Act of 1964. But what else you saw is black people could not vote. We couldn't elect our own people to office. And so you saw those who were in elected office really not doing work to represent black constituents, and black electeds were almost unheard of. And so what you saw was the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was one of the main goals of the civil rights movement, was to allow black people to vote. Now, up until 1965, between 1877 and 1965, they used all kinds of Jim Crow laws to prohibit black people from voting, because according to the Constitution, you can vote regardless of race. And so they would enact all of these other things that prevented black people from voting by saying, yes, it's not about race. It's, you can vote, everybody can vote if your grandfather voted. Now, where were most black people's grandfathers? No, but they weren't allowed to vote, because here, right, in the U.S., our grandfathers were enslaved people or just coming out of slavery, right? So most black people's grandfathers couldn't vote, right? They would enact literacy tests, right? So even if it was even if you could read, these literacy tests were written in a way that you really couldn't pass those tests. Some of y'all saw the film Selma. Selma does a really good job kind of going through this, right? And so there were all of these rules that were put in place to prevent black people from voting. And so the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was about lifting those barriers that local governments put in place to prevent black people from voting. Does that make sense to you all? It's interesting to watch what's happening in places like Georgia now, where you see similar restrictions on black voting, right? There's similar efforts to suppress the black vote. Like, you can't have long lines in black communities, right? You gotta wait 2 hours to vote. Most black people gotta get back to work, right? So you're not gonna be able to do that, right? Now they're even doing things like banning organizations from handing out water to people who are waiting in line to vote. And so there's efforts to suppress the black vote now. So anyway, we're told we're supposed to celebrate. There were massive celebrations about the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And even I sometimes talk with my radical friends, and they go, I don't vote because, you know, whatever. These candidates are all the same. The Democrats and the Republicans are no different. And I say I vote because Fannie Lou Hamer wanted me to vote. And so even if it's just to exercise, we got to remember, and you'll read more about Fannie Lou Hamer in the next book that we read, that people, when people say people died for your right to vote, people did die for your right to vote. So even if you don't believe in voting, if you don't believe in any of the candidates, I don't often believe in many of the candidates, but I do love my grandmother, and in her honor, I'm going to vote, right? Even if I write in, and I did, right? Even if I write in who the person I'm voting for is, I vote as an exercise to honor those people, okay? But what happens when we think about the civil rights movement, where is the civil rights movement taking place mostly, geographically?
South.
In the South, right? So Selma, you know Montgomery, the Montgomery bus boycott, right? You know, all of these places in the South where the civil rights movement is happening. But there's very little attention being paid to what's happening in urban centers. And we have to remember that there's a migration of black people from the South to urban centers, right? To places like Los Angeles, places like Chicago, places like New York. And black people's realities in urban centers are still oppressive, right? So my grandmother's sister is one of the people who moved to Los Angeles. And you think that moving from Beaumont, Texas to Los Angeles, now there's freedom, because were there segregated schools that were segregated explicitly by race? Or could you supposedly go to any school you want to?
Never segregated.
Supposedly not. Now, there's geographic segregation, but there wasn't a whites-only school here. Does that make sense to you? And so people came here and thought that they would be able to work. Now, I'm not saying that that's true all across the board, because there's still things like restrictive covenants that kept black people out of certain neighborhoods, and that, in effect, segregated schools, but it was different. It was a different kind of segregation and racism that you experienced in Los Angeles than you experienced in the South. What you had instead in urban centers like Los Angeles is the creation of systems meant to keep black people in line. So yes, you might get to go work at the Firestone plant, but you better not move west of Central Avenue, okay? And so what starts to happen is black people in urban centers are recognizing that even in these places, like Los Angeles, like San Francisco, there used to be black people in San Francisco, like Chicago, like Detroit, the systems are set up to be violent against you. So I don't think it's coincidental that just 5 days after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you have the Watts Uprising, also of 1965. Because what they're saying is, we're free. The last vestige of de jure segregation is over. Y'all can vote. You can even run for office, right? But black people are going, but our neighborhoods are still being over-policed. We're still being brutalized, and we are not free. And so you had especially black people rising up, especially black young people rising up and saying, we want something more than voting. And so you see all of these things. That 1965 becomes a watershed year that moves us from civil rights to black power. It moves black freedom movement from the South to urban centers. And it moves us from kind of this notion of respectability politics. You all seen like videos and photos of the civil rights marches. How were they dressed?
All nice in suits.
In suits. I'm going, y'all marched in them shoes? Right? Right. Respectability politics to resistance, to blatant out and out resistance, right? And then also I talked about being included in a fundamentally unjust system. It also raises questions about the validity of these systems we're trying to incorporate into. So, we are reading Blood in My Eye. We've talked about who George Jackson is, right? George Jackson, born in Chicago but raised right down the street in Pasadena, California. He was criminalized as a youth. We talked about that he was imprisoned for his part in a robbery at a gas station. $70 was stolen. Nobody was hurt. And yet he received a sentence of 1 year to life, right? These are his influences. You all know this. This is all in the book. I'm going to pull out just a couple of thoughts that George Jackson gave us, right? Somebody read that. Somebody read that. Listen. Go ahead, Cindy.
The slave revolution is an
Imperative.
A love-inspired, conscious act of desperation.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean to you? what does it mean that to the slave, and we would say what, enslaved people, right? To the slave, revolution is an imperative. What does that mean? Revolution is an imperative.
Basically, like, change is important.
Change is important. Is revolution simply change?
A fight, retaliation.
So these are all examples of revolution, right?
Yeah.
What does that look like to you when you see examples of revolution?
Examples like this,
Mhm.
taking back power.
So you have the Haitian Revolution, you have Nat Turner's rebellion, you have people that's actually at George Jackson's funeral, right? So you see masses of people, and what kind of change do you think they're seeking? Incorporation into a system?
Overthrowing the system.
Overthrowing the system, transforming the world as we know it. Revolution is about transformation, not simple reform, right? So if you're enslaved by a system, if the system, how do we define what it means to be enslaved? We are dehumanized, right? If you're enslaved by a system that tries to steal your very humanity, right? You can't tinker around the edges of that system, right? You have to be willing to do everything, put everything in to transform the world in which we live. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay. Revolution is an imperative, a love-inspired conscious act of desperation. If you love yourself, you will not submit to that system. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. I don't know what's wrong with this computer today. Did it go here? No. Okay, well, it's not gonna let me go, and it's 2:54. So I'm gonna send you a couple of things. Remember, we close out every class with a call to action. So you all have the extra credit opportunities for this week. There's a third one that I'm gonna send you, which is a reparations conference that's being held at Loyola Law School. Some of the most brilliant minds in the whole world are gonna be there. People like Sister Helen Jones, who's been fighting for her son who was killed inside Men's Central Jail in 2009. She's going to be there. People like Paula Miner, who's a member of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, will be there. But also people like Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who's one of the most brilliant people I know, and I get to call her my friend. She's going to be there. Justin Hansford from Howard Law will be there, and they're going to be talking about reparations as a result of police violence. That is also something that requires reparations. That's extra credit. There's going to be free breakfast, free lunch, free childcare. So there's no excuse to not go. It's going from September 8th to the 10th. And then we know tomorrow what happens every Wednesday. Huh?
But you get what we supposed to do.
Yeah. Well, she came.
There's-
Yes, you're all invited. Ayana's invited back. But you're all invited to the End Police Association's rally, and I'll drop the flyer in the grouping as well. Blessing, you should join. Are you already in?
No.
Okay, make sure you join.
We also have our student rally taking place tomorrow at 3:30 here on campus.
Right, the student rally at the Golden Eagle tomorrow at 3:30. And then we have coming up on the 12th is the trip to the Board of Trustees. Okay. All right, anything else? Oh, Thursday's class will not be in person, it'll be on Zoom. everybody's gonna be on Zoom on Thursday, so I won't forget about you, I promise, okay?
Well,